In the sweltering summer of 1598, within the formidable walls of El Escorial, something unspeakable was unfolding. It was not a grand battle or a political intrigue, but a silent, grotesque siege against the most powerful man on earth, King Philip II of Spain. A man who once commanded an empire where the sun never dared to set, was now fighting a losing war within the confines of his own decaying flesh. This is a story of absolute power meeting absolute vulnerability, a chilling reminder that even kings are but flesh and bone, destined to return to dust, sometimes in the most horrifying ways imaginable. Philip II, the son of Emperor Charles V, inherited a global empire that spanned continents. From the silver mines of the Americas to the spice islands of the Philippines, his dominion was unparalleled. He was the staunch defender of Catholic orthodoxy, sending his mighty armada against England and crushing Protestant heresies across Europe. His word alone could determine the fates of thousands. A single no on a state document could alter the course of history. He was revered, feared, and seen by many as God's chosen instrument on earth. But as the summer heat intensified, so did the cruel irony of his fate. For 52 agonizing days, the king who had once bestrode the world like a colossus lay trapped in his bed, his body a putrefying prison. The first whispers of decline had begun in the spring of 1598. At 71, Philip was an old man by the era's standards, his body already ravaged by decades of gout and severe arthritis. His fingers and toes were gnarled, his joints screamed with every movement. By 1591, he was confined to a wheelchair, yet his legendary work ethic remained unbroken. He would pore over state documents, his mind as sharp as ever, even as his body betrayed him. But June of 1598 brought a new, more sinister chapter. Fevers returned, more intense, more debilitating. Then the abscesses, first on his right knee, then his hand. They would swell, burst, drain, only to reform with a vengeance. Court physicians, armed with the limited knowledge of their time, applied poultices and prescribed bloodletting, believing they were balancing his humors. They were, in fact, only accelerating his torment. Philip, the very embodiment of Spanish etiquette and rigid formality, found his meticulously crafted world crumbling. The man who was once approached only with elaborate genuflection now lay in his own excrement, his servant struggling to change his bedding quickly enough. The proud king, whose every whim was law, was utterly dependent, stripped of all dignity. He could move only his head and left arm, a living statue of suffering. As July's heat baked the stone walls of El Escorial, the king's suffering reached new depths. The abscesses multiplied, blossoming across his chest, groin, and legs, each one a weeping testament to the relentless march of infection. From these suppurating wounds rose a stench so profound, so utterly vile, that even his most devoted attendants struggled to remain in the royal chamber. It was the smell of death, of decay, a miasma that clung to the air, seeping into the tapestries and permeating the palace corridors. Courtiers would press perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses as they scurried past, their faces a mask of polite horror. Philip, still agonizingly lucid, ordered the windows kept shut, not for his comfort, but to spare others the indignity of his royal putrefaction. Contemporary accounts, once dismissed as exaggerations, paint a truly horrific picture. His body, a canvas of bursting pustules, never truly healed. Instead, these open sores became fertile ground for something far more insidious. In early August, they arrived. Lice. Perhaps carried in by a servant, or birthed from the perpetually damp, sweat-soaked bedding, they found in Philip's festering body a perfect, defenseless host. They multiplied with terrifying speed, feeding on his blood and the abundant dead tissue. Soon his body was swarming. Attendants, working tirelessly, would remove handfuls of the parasites, only to find new hordes hours later. Diego Deza, Philip's confessor, would later write, almost in disbelief, that the lice seemed to breed within the wounds themselves, emerging from the king's own rotting flesh. The most powerful man in Europe had become a living hive, a testament to nature's brutal indifference to earthly titles. But the lice were merely the prelude. The true horror lay deeper. Royal physician André Samurio de Alfaro documented with clinical detachment that the king's wounds began to develop a putrid and corrupt matter in which many maggots were engendered. These larvae, likely of common flies drawn to the stench, had found their way into his open lesions and begun their gruesome feast on his decaying tissue. Imagine the scene. A man once deemed semi-divine, whose touch was believed by some to cure scrofola, now lay watching, utterly helpless, as worms rhythmed beneath his skin and emerged from his wounds. Each morning, servants would meticulously clean away the maggots, only to find new hordes by the following day. Philip, his faith his only solace amidst this living hell, is said to have remarked, "Lord, how greatly these offenses against you weigh upon me, though it pleases me to think how small they are compared to my sins." It was a macabre acceptance, a king's last desperate attempt to find meaning in his degradation. As August bled into September, new horrors manifested. The constant pressure against his immobile body had created massive bed sores, particularly on his right hip and lower back. These pressure ulcers, exacerbated by his inability to move and the perpetual dampness of his bedding, eventually wore through skin, fat, and muscle, exposing bone. Royal chronicler Sea de Otro recounted one ulcer on his right hip that grew so large it was possible to see into the internal cavity of his body, the size of a fist. This nightmarish wound became a grotesque ecosystem, a primary breeding ground for maggots that multiplied faster than they could be removed. Friar José de Siguneza chillingly documented that attendants removed material enough to fill 2 silver basins daily from this single wound. Some accounts even suggested that the larvae would burrow deeper when disturbed, quite literally consuming the king from within. The flies, now a constant torment, were not content with just his wounds. As his condition deteriorated, they began to infest his mouth, nose, and ears. Unable to brush them away, the once feared monarch could only endure as insects crawled across his face and into his orifices. Many historians now believe Philip suffered from myiasis, a condition where fly larvae invade living tissue throughout the body. Adding to this catalog of suffering was his worsening gout, which made even the slightest touch to his extremities excruciating. Yet his body had to be moved, had to be cleaned. Each time attendants attempted to shift his position or remove soiled bedding, Philip's screams, primal and guttural, echoed through the palace halls. The monarch who had impassively watched heretics burn at autos da fe now begged for mercy from his own servants. Throughout this horrific ordeal, Philip's mind remained remarkably intact. This clarity was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his deterioration. He was fully aware of his transformation from sovereign to carrion, from a living monument of Spanish glory to a rotting spectacle within the very walls he had built. He remained steadfast in his Catholic faith, requesting daily Mass and the reading of religious texts. In between bouts of pain, he would discuss affairs of state with his son and heir, the future Philip III, his voice a frail echo of his former authority, his mind still grappling with the burdens of an empire, even as his body dissolved around him. By early September, new symptoms compounded his agony. Persistent diarrhea, possibly from intestinal infection or a side effect of his treatments, further weakened him and added to the omnipresent filth. Renal failure began, causing his legs and abdomen to swell dramatically with edema.
This fluid retention stretched his already compromised skin to breaking point, creating new ruptures, new entry points for infection, new feeding grounds for his tiny, relentless tormentors. Court physician Garcia de Mate documented a high fever accompanied by delirium, a clear sign of sepsis, the body's final, desperate fight against an overwhelming enemy. In his more lucid moments, Philip reportedly asked repeatedly for a particular crucifix, the same one his father, Emperor Charles V, had held as he died. This symbolic connection to his imperial legacy seemed to offer some solace, even as his own bodily sovereignty dissolved into chaos and corruption. The treatments themselves, ironically, likely exacerbated his suffering. Following the flawed humoral theory of the
doctors applied caustic substances to his wounds in a futile attempt to balance his bodily fluids. These chemicals, which included arsenic compounds and mercury preparations, would have burned his already compromised tissues and potentially accelerated necrosis. Frequent bloodletting, sometimes daily, further weakened a monarch desperately in need of strength. His diet, meager broths and watered wine, offered little sustenance. The combined effects of infection, parasitic infestation, blood loss, and malnutrition created the perfect storm for his body's complete collapse. His heart, straining against systemic failure, began to show signs of arrhythmia, his breathing becoming increasingly labored. Even the weather seemed to conspire against him. The summer of 1598 was unusually hot, transforming El Escorial's stone walls into a furnace. This elevated temperature accelerated the breeding cycles of the lice and flies, intensifying his torment and hastening the decomposition of his wounded flesh. The few windows in his chamber, kept partially closed to contain the stench, admitted little breeze to cool his fever-racked body or disperse the miasma of decay that hung like a pall over the royal bed. By the second week of September, the end was undeniably near. Philip, still conscious despite his extreme suffering, called for his children to receive his blessing. His son, the future Philip III, who had largely been shielded from the worst of his father's deterioration, was visibly shocked. The young prince reportedly had to leave the room several times, overcome by both the sight and the smell of his once formidable father, now reduced to a writhing, infested shell. In a final, heartbreaking act of kingly duty, Philip attempted to impart wisdom to his heir. Gesturing weakly to his ruined body, he reportedly warned his son about the temporary nature of earthly power. "I have been treated like an old dog," he is said to have told the prince. "Remember this when you wear the crown." Was it a caution against pride, or a bitter acknowledgement of his abandonment by courtiers who could no longer bear his presence? The answer is lost to history, but the image of a dying king, consumed by his own flesh, remains. On September 13, 1598, Philip requested the final sacraments. His confessor administered extreme unction, anointing what few parts of the king's body could still be touched without causing screams of agony. Throughout the ritual, observers noted with macabre fascination that flies continued to land on the holy oil, drawn by the smell of putrefaction that no amount of incense could mask. In a tableau that would have pleased the most ardent Vanitas painter, the symbols of divine grace mingled with the stark evidence of mortal corruption. The king's final hours were marked by increasing respiratory distress as fluid filled his lungs, the final insult in a cascade of systemic failures. His breathing became labored and rattling, each exhale carrying the fetid odor of internal decay. At 5 o'clock on the morning of September 13th, after asking for the crucifix to be placed on his chest, Philip II of Spain drew his last breath. The monarch who had commanded the wealth of the New World and the might of Europe's greatest army had finally been conquered by the smallest of adversaries. The task of preparing the royal corpse presented unprecedented challenges. Traditional embalming procedures proved nearly impossible given the advanced state of decomposition. According to court records, the body was so compromised that it began to break apart when moved. The royal embalmers worked quickly, using prodigious amounts of perfumes, spices, and preservative compounds in an attempt to make the remains presentable for lying in state. Despite these desperate efforts, the king's body continued to deteriorate rapidly. The funeral proceedings were consequently abbreviated, with only the most essential rituals performed before the sealed casket was hurried to the royal crypt beneath El Escorial. There, Philip was interred alongside his father and his multiple wives, his physical corruption finally hidden from view, if not from memory or history. Word of the king's horrific end spread quickly throughout Europe, eliciting varied responses. In Protestant England and the Netherlands, where Philip had been viewed as a tyrant and persecutor, accounts of his suffering were received with barely concealed satisfaction. Pamphlets circulated, suggesting his gruesome death was divine retribution for the Inquisition's tortures and the bloodshed of the Dutch revolt. Queen Elizabeth I of England, Philip's longtime adversary, reportedly remarked upon hearing the details, "We should not mock the afflictions of princes, for they remind us all of our common mortality." Yet in Catholic territories, particularly in Spain itself, official accounts of Philip's death were sanitized, emphasizing his piety and dignity in facing his final trial. Court chroniclers omitted the more disturbing details, focusing instead on his reception of the sacraments and his concern for the succession. The Spanish people were told their king had died as he had lived, as a pillar of Catholic virtue and royal fortitude. Medical historians now believe Philip suffered from a combination of conditions. His long-standing gout had likely developed into a form of rheumatoid arthritis, which compromised his immune system. This, combined with diabetes, suggested by his symptoms of excessive thirst and edema, created the perfect conditions for the development of multiple infections. The specific cause of his pustules and abscesses may have been a systemic staphylococcal infection, while his immobility led to the development of stage 4 pressure ulcers that provided entry points for maggot infestation. What makes Philip's case particularly notable is not just the extent of his physical suffering, but how it functioned as a grotesque inversion of his earthly power. The monarch who commanded men to die in battle by the thousands could not command the insects to leave his flesh. The king whose word could condemn heretics to fire could not stop his own body from becoming a breeding ground for vermin. As historian William H. Prescott later wrote, "No amount of power or wealth could purchase exemption from the physical laws to which all mortality is subject." Philip's death serves as more than just a gruesome historical footnote. It stands as a powerful memento mori, a reminder that power, no matter how absolute, offers no immunity against the fundamental vulnerabilities of the human condition. His demise represented the ultimate democratic principle, that kings and commoners alike must face the indignity of physical decay. The only difference is that Philip's status ensured his suffering would be meticulously documented and remembered centuries later. The irony of his end was not lost on contemporary observers. Philip had spent decades prosecuting wars to defend Catholic orthodoxy and the divine right of kings. He had presented himself as God's chosen instrument on earth, the defender of true faith against heresy. Yet his final days suggested no divine intervention, no miraculous preservation of the royal body. Instead, the most Catholic king suffered a death that seemed more like a punishment than blessing. Abandoned, it appeared, by the very God whose cause he had championed. For the Spanish Empire, Philip's death marked the beginning of a long, slow decline. His son, Philip III, lacked his father's work ethic and administrative skill. Within decades, Spain would begin to lose territories and influence, eventually surrendering its position as Europe's dominant power. Some historians have suggested that the horror of witnessing his father's end contributed to the younger Philip's reluctance to fully engage with the burdens of kingship, preferring to delegate power to favorites while pursuing pleasure. The El Escorial Palace, which Philip II had envisioned as the center of world power and a monument to Spanish greatness, would never again serve as the effective command center of a world empire. Instead, it would gradually transform into what its architecture had always suggested it might become, a magnificent mausoleum. Today, visitors can tour the royal apartments where Philip suffered his agonizing end, though they hear sanitized versions of his death that focus on his piety rather than his physical corruption. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Philip's horrific demise is the way it has shaped our historical imagination. His death serves as a powerful reminder that the distance between the heights of human power and the depths of human vulnerability is not as great as we might wish to believe. The king who ruled half the world discovered in his final days that he could not rule the processes of his own body. A lesson as relevant to modern leaders as it was in the 16th century. For all his territorial conquests and political machinations, Philip II is perhaps most vividly remembered today for the manner of his leaving this world. Not in glory on the battlefield, not in peaceful sleep surrounded by loving family, but in a protracted nightmare of corruption and
His story reminds us that history's judgment often comes not in how we wield power, but in how we face its inevitable loss. From the greatest monarch of his age to food for worms. Not after death, as happens to all, but while still living, still thinking, still feeling every bite. As we conclude this dark journey through the final days of Philip II, we might reflect on the words supposedly found among his private papers after his death. To have been and not to be is not to be at all. For a king obsessed with legacy and remembrance, there is bitter irony in being remembered not for the empire he built, but for the grotesque spectacle of his disintegration. His death has outlived his achievements in our collective memory, serving as a visceral reminder that power is always temporary, that glory always fades, and that in the end, nature renders all equal. Kings and commoners alike returning to dust, sometimes inch by excruciating inch. What does Philip II's agonizing end reveal about the true nature of power and mortality? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the darker corners of history.